Hello, Bobs. Today, in the Jeffers installment, we're going to have Of Una Jeffers, a memoir written by her friend Edith Greenan. You can see there was also a reissue of this book by Storyline Press. The original was by Ward Ritchie Press, who was a friend of Jeffers. There's Una, and later day Una, 39, which would have been about 10 years before her death. The revised edition had many more pictures, and it also shows many more photos of Edith. There's Edith dancing by the sea, Carmel by the sea, very picturesque. I mean, Edith married Una's ex-husband, Teddy Custer, who Robinson Jeffers, had an affair with when they first met at, I think it was UCLA. Teddy sent her to Europe for a year to stay away from Jeffers, but it didn't work. I mean, Edith wasn't bad looking herself. She's actually a pretty good looking lady. But I'll open this window so I can read the text better, even though it puts a glare on this blocky mylar jacket. Got some bear too. Also show you this book is fairly rare. It's one of 250 copies. Nice unicorn. Una loved unicorns. Unicorns. Ken Sanders sticker. It says I paid $125 for the book, but I don't recall. It was originally $4, written in 1939. Of Una Jeffers. Again, we're back here. There's the unicorn with Una's corn. Copyright 1939 by Edith Greenan. To my Maeve, Jimmy and Owen. As you'll see, Una and Robin's first child, Maeve, died early in infancy, I believe. For many years, I have wished to set down some of my memories of Una and what her friendship has meant to me. This little book grew from that wish. I must express my thanks here to Marcella Burke for her enthusiastic help in giving shape to these memories, and to Robin and Una for their warm interest, and for permission to print for the first time 3 poems and a fragment written by Robin, e.g. Edith Greenan. This little book characterizes 2 unusual women and is a memoir of their friendship, but the origin of duration and circumstances of this friendship make it unique, I think, in literature and perhaps in life. It began 26 years ago. 30 years ago, it would hardly have been possible. 50 years ago, hardly conceivable. Even at present time, it would seem an unlikely friendship, yet it has always been natural and unstrained. Yeah, for their side of it, even though you stole Teddy's wife. Anyway, however, this is not what interested me when I read the book, for it was already familiar to me, but the recaptured beauty and simplicity of many incidents in yesterday's moved me rather deeply. There are persons who can savor life fully in its passing moments, as Una Jeffers does, and gather it and savor it again in remembrance. There are others like myself to whom things come slowly, and are never quite realized when they happen, but only afterwards, sometimes long afterwards. This little book has made me realize again more fully many lovely memories, and especially the undeserved good fortune that has followed me like a hound, ever since I knew the woman whom Edith Greenan, too, seems to use for Polestar. Una Jeffers illustrations. Probably shouldn't be reading this book since it's one of 250 copies and is fairly rare, but we'll read it. I wanted to meet Una. I wanted to meet her more than anyone else in the world. Una has a wondrous Una was a wondrous, lovely person. I had heard about her beauty, her brilliance, her understanding. Una had been the wife of the man I was engaged to marry, Edward Custer. His nickname was Teddy. He told me all these things about her. In some curious, indefinable way, I began to feel that our marriage would never be a success unless I knew Una. Their marriage wasn't a success, they divorced. When Edward first discovered that Una had fallen in love with Robinson Jeffers, he couldn't or didn't want to believe what he heard. He didn't even believe Una when she told him honestly and simply, "Yes, it is true, I do love Robin." Edward was stubborn. He asked her to go away to Europe for a year, to think things over, so she had gone, even promised not to write to Robin. After several months, a friend wrote telling her that Edward was interested, absorbed in some other girl. I was that girl. What Una didn't know was that Edward had already started divorce proceedings. A long time afterwards, when we were close friends, Una told me how overjoyed she was when she heard that Teddy had found someone else. It automatically simplified things. It released her. Una was madly in love with Robin, but she had a deep, tender feeling for Teddy. She was very sad. She didn't like hurting him, but there was no possible way to avoid it. I mean, there was. On the unforgettable rainy night when Edward took me to meet Una for the first time, I was panic-stricken and pathetically self-conscious. Una was visiting old friends, Hazel and Roy Pinkham. They lived in a house on a hill high above Los Angeles. As we rounded the last curve of their driveway, I could see the lights of the city below us. I looked at them, silently longing to disappear, to lose myself in that great impersonal sweep of shimmering light. We stopped in front of the house and ran quickly up the steps for shelter from the downpour. I remember to this day how I stood there, staring fixedly at the heavy knocker while my knees shook. On the other side of that impressive door was Una. Wild terror seized me. I clung to Edward's arm, speechless. He patted my hand and smiled down at me. "Don't be frightened, Edith. You two are going to love each other." I managed a wan sort of smile. Edward lifted the knocker. The door opened. Across a charmingly furnished drawing room, I saw Una sitting beside an open fire. I recognized her instantly. She was exactly as Edward had described her to me. When she saw us, she rose and walked swiftly to the room, across the room. I had never seen anyone so incredibly graceful. I mean, that might be. Let me get some beer. I have to take all this sycophancy in. I had never seen anyone so incredibly graceful. Actually, Una didn't walk. She smiled, then was there at our side. She moved without effort, like sunlight. "Why, Edith, how nice." She leaned over and impulsively kissed me on the cheek. Her deep blue eyes smiled a warm, friendly greeting. I was tongue-tied. With a swift, intuitive sense of delicacy, she understood my miserable shyness. She didn't wait for me to say anything. She turned to Edward and with a little exclamation of dismay held out her hands for his driving gloves. Gracious, they're soaking wet. She carried them over to the fireplace and placed them on the hearthstones. They were full of rain and quickly made little pools. I thought the gloves standing up from the cuffs looked like desperate hands, raised in supplication. How illuminating that protective gesture of Una's was. In a flash, their former relationship as husband and wife became a formidable barrier, a barrier that had not existed before. A man says, "my first wife," but those are words making little echoes. Now, suddenly, Una's tenderness, her possessiveness, pushed me out of the picture so completely I became more incoherent than I would have been ordinarily. In my heart, I knew Una did not do this deliberately to hurt me. She just hadn't let go of Edward completely. No, she just traded them up. Una, oh, sorry, I'll stop commenting. Actually, I won't. The more beer I drink, the more I will comment. Una and Edward had been married for many years. Her concern for his gloves was an unconscious, repetitious little act. Meeting your husband's first wife is far more difficult than meeting his mother. It becomes an emotional, feminine crisis. If Adam and Eve had to face such undercurrents, the human race might have ended then and there. As the evening passed, I watched and listened to Una with a sudden, deep emotion. I already adored her. She was the most alluring, unstudied woman I had ever met. I began to hate me. I hated being 17. Whoa, that's right, she was 17. No wonder why she looked so fresh-faced in those photos. I hated being 17 with such sudden fury, it was frightening. I wondered at the time, too unhappy to see any humor in the occasion, if Una and her friends pitied Edward for his second choice. I certainly knew they must have been dismayed at my bleak silences. I couldn't talk. I felt lost in Una's rich, intellectual world. I realized so poignantly the great challenge I had to accept. Una and Edward had shared so much. They knew life and the world. They knew and loved the arts. I had only a meager education gleaned from a public school in a small California town. I sensed how preposterous it must have appeared for a young, unsophisticated girl from Bakersfield ever to attempt to take Una's place. My problem was gargantuan. As all things passed through my mind, I really suffered. Una held the center of the stage the entire evening. The innumerable, colorful stories she told filled the room with laughter. She made a lovely picture wearing a black velvet gown, Empire style, which she herself had designed. Her dark brown hair with red glints in it was bound around her head, making her look more than ever with her heart-shaped face like a Botticelli Madonna. And Una's skin, unbelievably white, translucent, the texture of jasmine petals. Even her jewelry reflected her individuality. A curious necklace of amber, exquisitely cut, a medieval gold ring and bracelet set with enormous topazes. A delicate, faraway fragrance clung to her. She told me it was sandalwood and that she had never used anything else. One of my least favorite scents. I think Una is fond of sandalwood in a mystical sense. It links her with the past, with another very old world she feels at home in. Robin loves it too, and always says by this fragrance he could recognize Una, even in hell. As we left, I thought perhaps Una harbored a little bitterness, or why had she so completely overshadowed me? But I was wrong. It was inevitable that she should dominate any group of people she was with. No one ever wants it to be otherwise. But at the time, I confess, I had a typical feminine reaction. I felt frustrated by this beautiful woman who was so sure of her every word and gesture. As we drove away, I muttered unhappily, "Edward, that was a Judas kiss of Una's." "No, Edith, you are wrong," he said. "Didn't you notice or hear Una humming to herself several times during the evening?" "Yes, I heard her," I replied gloomily. Edward chuckled, inordinately amused. "Una was just as nervous over this meeting as you were. She always hums when she's nervous." Some way, this reassured me. If Una had been self-conscious too, I felt less awkward about our first meeting. Not long ago, Edward and I met at a cocktail party in Hollywood given for Charles Coburn. Many years had passed since that long-ago night. Edward and I had divorced, and I believe for the first time we had found our rightful places. Edward was now married to a lovely girl called Gabrielle. They had 2 children. And I was married to Jim Greenan and divinely happy. We had 3 adorable children, and to make this marriage everything I had dreamed and hoped the marriage would be. Now, against the background of animated shop talk of the theater, pictures, personalities, Edward and I visited for the first time in years. And as always before, we talked of Una. I tried to explain how much her friendship had meant to me, what a beloved figure of guidance she had been. Edward nodded, understanding perfectly, but he couldn't resist teasing. "Do you remember how cynical you were? You even suspected Una's kiss." I acknowledged this, deeply chagrined. Edward smiled quizzically. "You know, Edith, I knew I was right when I brought you 2 together." I knew it was all right, but I was powerless to make it clear to you at that time. We talked on, and I was glad for the opportunity it gave me to tell Edward something I had always wanted to say, how truly grateful I was, not alone for Una's friendship, which he had made possible, but for the doors he had opened so generously, taking me to my first symphony concerts, to the ballet, to the theater, to see every important artist who came west, for a library of carefully chosen books. So, I concluded, you gave me great riches. Ah, Edith, you are kind, but Una brought all these things to me first, and I, in turn, passed them on to you. We admitted, and no one could know better than we two, Una's great power, which moves every life she touches. Not alone mine, and Edward's, and Robinson Jeffers's, and her twin boys, Garth and Donnan. Everyone is richer for knowing her. And everyone who has been touched by her warm hand has been molded by it. Una inherited her passionate Irish nature from her mother. Her rages and mad bursts of temper are always exciting. There is something forever thrilling about Una's unleashed emotions, and because Robin is by nature cold, the contrast has never ceased to fascinate him. She is more like a woman in a Scotch ballad, passionate, unarmed, and rather heroic, or like a falcon than like any ordinary person, writes Robin, who cheated on her at least twice. The second time, at least twice, and the purported second time she shot herself in the chest. And the bullet deflected, so she didn't die. But yeah, she was a lioness. Before they were married, occasional letters used to come to Robin from some girl who had perhaps fallen in love with him during that time when Una was in Europe. This would make Una simply furious. She resented these letters, and she thought of some other woman in Robin's life. She would turn into a thunderbolt of rage and tear the letters into pieces, into tiny pieces. Enough of such things, she would say, and the air would be full of violent, dire threatenings. Then Robin would throw his head back and laugh, which is a rare thing for him to do, and he would call her Little Savage, and sweep her into his arms, and a swift peace would quiet Una's fury. But Robin confesses that he had trembled too. I asked her one day if her mother ever got as upset about her father as she did about Robin. My, yes, her eyes twinkled. She quoted the old Gaelic saying, the women of the village are in madness and trouble, pulling their hair and letting it go with the wind. Mother behaved exactly like that if my father didn't come home when he was supposed to. She would race up and down the garden with her long hair blowing around her face. My father was a sheriff in a small town in Michigan. When he was courting my mother, he used to call for her in a sleigh drawn by a pair of beautiful gray horses. Mother was very pretty and quite vain. There's young Una. The first time she went riding with her ardent suitor, she wore a long blue chiffon veil. She was terribly proud of it. Una laughed. They were riding along, ever so gay, when all at once the wind tore Mother's veil off, and it floated away over the snowy field, out of sight beyond the black treetops. Quite a long time afterwards, after Mother and Father were married, they found wisps of a blue veil woven into a bird's nest in their garden. Yeats's mother was very much like mine. He wrote this about her. She read few books, but she and the fisherman's wife would tell each other stories that Homer might have told, pleased with any moment of sudden intensity and laughing together over any point of satire. She pretended to nothing she did not feel. Like her mother, Una is delighted with any absurdity, any abrupt indiscretion of events. It's fun to be with her, so full of gaiety and laughter. Never a shadow across her heart unless someone she loves is in danger. Yet I wonder why her face is often so sad and repose. One evening, a year after Una and Robin were married, Robin was reading aloud to us. He picked up a book and said, there is the most perfect description of Una in this. I couldn't have written a better one. De Quincey wrote it, describing Dorothy Wordsworth. She was short and slight, a glancing quickness in all her movements, with a warm, even ardent manner and a speech agitated by her excessive organic sensibilities. Her eyes, not soft, but wild and startling, which seemed to glow with some subtle fire that burned within her. The predominant impression was not of the intellect, but of the exceeding sympathy, always ready and always profound, by which she made all that one could tell reverberate to one's own feelings by the manifest impression that it made on hers. The pulses of light are not more quick or more inevitable in their flow and undulation than were the answering echoes and movements of her sympathizing attention. I may sum up her character as a companion by saying that she was the very wildest in the sense of the most natural person I have ever known, and also the truest, most inevitable, and at the same time the quickest and readiest in her sympathies with either joy or sorrow, laughter or tears, with the realities of life or the eager realities of the poets. She could sympathize with all the fervor of her passionate heart, an exquisite regard for common things, a quick discernment of the one point of interest or beauty in the most ordinary incident, was the secret of her spell on all who met her. Back to Shadow. The second time I met Una was at the home of Fanny Rowan, a woman of extraordinary charm, friendly, and kind towards everyone. Fan was a close friend of Una's. They traveled abroad together in 1912. Fanny had just married an Englishman, Harry Young. Harry and Una had been friends for many years. He had done many pleasant things for Una in England, and he was teasing her about her meeting with a friend of his at a gallery in London. He had said to the man, who had never seen Una, "Look for a Botticelli Madonna wearing a Panama hat." It was Harry, who declared years afterwards, when he and Fan and their son were at Torhouse, "I didn't know whether Una built this tower or wrote the poems. I'll wager she did one or the other." Robin was at Fan's with Una. It was the first time I had ever seen him. Fanny was exceedingly gracious. She was one of the few friends who did not seem to mind about Una's divorce. But she was not particularly enthusiastic about Robin. She resented his not talking. He was silent the entire evening, just sat and watched Una. She was wearing a soft amber-colored corduroy gown, long-waisted, Russian in effect. Long full sleeves gathered into tight bands at the wrist, very foreign-looking. Later, Fanny said vehemently, "Oh, I could weep for Una. If she marries Jeffers, it will be a frightful mistake. It can never be a successful marriage." Poor Fanny, with her conventional social background, was incapable of coping with such an unsocial person as Robin. Robin looked then very much as he does today, tall, lean, rangy, with the greatest restraint in every move he made. Robin doesn't seem to dislike people or to like them very much. When I talked to him, he answered me in a curious low voice, just a few words, slightly humorous, but to the point. Robin's eyes are strange, blue-gray in color. It is difficult to look into them. No, I can't get any more light into this. You're going to get a half page of light, a half page of darkness, just like Robin's soul. When I talked to him, he answered me in a curious low voice, just a few words, slightly humorous, but to the point. Robin's eyes are strange, blue-gray in color. It is difficult to look into them, for in some unconscious way, his eyes look through and beyond one. When it happens, it is fearsome and disturbing, because one feels so alone. Afterwards, so stripped. He seemed so distant and apart from all of us, but it wasn't an intolerant apartness. Never that with Robin. He is too compassionate. This, my first meeting with Robin, was 26 years ago, and it was the second meeting with Una. I admired her more than ever, with all the fervent adoration a young girl feels for a glamorous old friend. I adored Una and wanted to be like her in every possible way. I even started the next day to design my own clothes, not copying Una's, but working out ideas to suit my personality, and I went shopping, hoping to find a perfume which would become a part of me, just as Una's sandalwood perfume was identified so unforgettably with her. Again, Una was the fascinating center of attraction the entire evening. She seemed to be sincerely interested in me, and she said she hoped I liked her too, and that we could meet often and become true friends. I don't know if we can make it to the next part. Robin and Una went away to live in a cottage by Lake Washington near Seattle. After 9 months, they returned to stay temporarily with Robin's parents in Pasadena. Although Una disliked Southern California intensely, she adored the northern hills and sea and wanted to be near them. She hated the drabness of just houses next to each other and across the street from each other. The terrific heat added to her unhappiness. But she liked the big enclosed garden around the Jeffers' home, filled with flowers and every kind of fruit. "We are leading a theocratin life here," she wrote me, "sitting under the grape arbor through the hot, shimmering afternoons, the air heavy with fragrance of peaches and roses. Later, the nice man who lives next door will come along that marigold path to bring me a yellow bowl brimming with goat's milk." She was happy with the simplicity of life in the Jeffers family, the music, the books, and the walks in the evenings. Una at this time had no desire for parties or people. She only wanted to have Robin with her. She was in the first ecstasy of love fulfilled and looking forward to a radiant future. Her days began and ended with Robin. She called Robin's mother Bellemere. Mrs. Jeffers was a tall woman who carried herself proudly erect at all times. She had a great dignity and grace, great refinement, and an interesting cultural background. Her forebears were Tuttles and Robinsons, who played an important role in New England. An accomplished musician, she sang and played the piano and organ exceptionally well. It was she who said after Una and Robin married that it was Una and Una alone who could bring her son to great accomplishments. I never saw Robin's father, but I have heard many stories about his brilliant scholastic record. I felt as though I knew him much better after going into his library. He was a distinguished theologian, a scholar in Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and Arabic. He had traveled extensively in Syria, Greece, and Egypt. He was many years older than Robin's mother. He died in December in the year 1914. Before that, when I had been at Jeffers' home, Una had invariably said, "The doctor is put away in his library, deciphering something very erudite." With all her love of scholarship, she fainted at mention of Sanskrit and Hebrew. Una has given me permission to print this hitherto unpublished poem of Robin's. It is one of the many morning songs he wrote to her. Each day when she opened her eyes, there beside her was a poem or a little freshly gathered nosegay. This one was written in Pasadena in 1915. They slept there on a balcony which overhung the garden. Yellow and white banksia roses cascaded over it. Mockingbirds sang all night in the pepper trees beside it, and little wandering winds brought them fragrance from dew-drenched flowers, all a part of that theocratin idyll. I think we will stop here. And now, I will stop here and continue with the poem tomorrow. Goodbye.